All right. Good evening. We're all here.
Yes,
Okay.
everybody is here. Everybody is here.
Everyone. Okay. Okay. We're going to start. Okay. So it's been a couple of weeks. So we're up to the fourth parak of Bava Basra. I wanted to talk about the end of the third parak. So the third parak, as we know, Cheskas Habatim, very intense parak. We have about a month without any Agadata. I think off the top of my head, that's the longest by far out of any Gemara that goes straight with halacha without any real agadata. Toward the end, we see some stories on Daf Nun Zayin and on Daf Nun Ches, and on Daf Nun Tes, it reverts back to concept of a chazaka, what's called a chezkas tashmishin, meaning if you do something and nobody protests, are you able to claim a chazaka for something specific? And I wanted to just begin. I'm going to start on Daf Nuntes Amar Aleph. Okay, 59a on the bottom. Okay, it's a little technical, but it leads up to an interesting topic that actually reverts back to way in the beginning of the Masechta on Daf Beis of Hezek Riyah, which I don't believe we spoke about yet. So this is a good opportunity for some major for some major chazara. So let's look together on Nun Tes Amud Aleph on the bottom. The Mishnah says Haziz ad tefach yesh lo chazaka. So again, we use the word chazaka interchangeably. We used it for many weeks regarding land. Okay, I have a claim on a land, and no one protested, and I kept my shtar for a certain amount of time. So after 3 years, the Gemara says, as we all know, you have a chazaka on that property, on that real estate, on that house. Then there's, like we said, there's a chazaka that you have, which is called usage, which the Gemara uses the word cheskas tashmishin. So the Mishnah brings a case where if I have, and it gets, like I said, it gets a little technical, but there are two people who live next to each other. You have Ruvain, whose house is at the border of a chutzner, and then you have other people that live in the chutzner. Okay, so you have a case where you have a roof, for example, or you have an upper story, and you have like a beam or a windowsill or some kind of protrusion that is coming from your structure. Okay, and it's coming out of your wall into your neighbor's courtyard. Okay, and the Mishnah says it's coming out a tefach. It's coming out a little bit. Okay, so you can establish a chazaka, the Mishnah says, okay, for having that beam cantilever into the chutzner, and the person who resides in the chutzner cannot go and one day knock off your beam that's coming off of your balcony, okay, because you acquire that chazaka right away. Meaning the way the Rashbam explains it is nobody would ever see something and ignore it if it really, really bothered him. So therefore, because he wasn't moche, because this owner or this shareholder in the chutzner was not moche, he did not protest. Okay, so therefore it must be he's okay with this ziz, with this beam or this structure protruding into his chutzner a little bit. Okay, so that's what the Mishnah said. Haziz atefach yesh lo chazaka, and the Mishnah continues on Nuntes Amud Beis v'yachol limchos, and because it's chazaka-able, he has the right. The Baal HaChatzar has the right to protest and say, "Hey, get that out of here." Okay, and because he didn't, Okay, because he didn't, he loses. But but the Mishnah ends off by saying if it's so minute, if it's less than a tefach, okay, and one day the Baal HaChatzer, for example, says, you know what, I want to build something in my Chatzer, and he looks up, and there's this little tiny protrusion coming out of the neighbor's wall, okay, he could still build it, but the owner of the wall can claim it's a chazaka and say, oh, this person wasn't moche, because such a little amount is not enough for someone, for an average person to be makbid and care. So therefore, it's like a little, it's like an inch or two coming out. He's going to be he's going to be reasonable and say, okay, you could leave it, right? So therefore, because it's something that is not mocha'able, you can't be mocha, therefore there's no chazaka on it, right? As if you remember, macha and chazaka go hand in hand, as we learned way back when a month ago in the beginning of the parak, right? That macha and chazaka go hand in hand, right? The ma'arer has to be able to be mocha, and the owner of the field has to hear it, has to know that it's being protested. Okay, so that's what the Mishnah says. So if you go to the Gemara skip a few lines by the two dots. Says Pachas mitevach ein lo chazak ve'eino yachol limchos. I'm on the 7th or so line on Nun Tes Amud Beis. Amar Rav Huna lo shanu ela bal hagag bebal hachatzer. So who is protesting what? So Rav Huna says that the Mishnah is talking about that the Bal Hagag, okay, again, in our case, Ruvain's wall has a protrusion coming out into a chutzner that's partly owned by Shimon. Okay, so Rav Huna qualifies and says that when the Mishnah says that if it's less than a tefach, the owner of the chutzner cannot be mocha, cannot protest. It's only from the Baal Hagag, which is Ruvain, who has this protrusion coming out, to the Baal HaChatzer, and say, hey, he can't protest and say, the Rashbam says, De'eno yochel limchos bo v'lomar al tishtamish b'ziz shali, and Ruvain cannot say, hey, you can't use my little protrusion to my hifsid Baal Hagag, because what does the Baal Hagag, in this case Ruvain, have to lose? Halo kishishtamish Baal HaChatzer, what's the big deal? Because when the Baal HaChatzer, presumably, again, what's going on over here? The Baal HaChatzer presumably wants to use that protrusion for something. He wants to put something up on the wall. After all, it is protruding into his Chatzer. So therefore, he says, hey, Baal Hagag, what do you care? I have usage in this Chatzer also, right? And when I hang something up, I'm not going to see you, right? And there's no, as we're going to see, there's no hezekriya, right? There's no privacy issues. So therefore, we're never going to see each other. So therefore, don't give me a hard time. However, says the Gemara, aval balachatz b'bal hagag yachol limchos. But the opposite, meaning the Baal HaChatzer, I'm sorry, but according to Rav Huna, the Baal HaChatzer, Shimon, could be mocha to the Baal Hagag and say, hey, you cannot have that protrusion come out less than a tefach, okay? Because we may see each other, and there's going to be a hezekriya. So again, it only works one way according to Rav Huna, that the macha can't be from the Baal Hagag to the Baal HaChatzer. The Baal Hagag cannot give the Baal HaChatzer a hard time, but the Baal HaChatzer can give the Baal Hagag a hard time. Rabbi Yehuda Amar afilu Baal HaChatzer Baal Hagag eni yachol limchos. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no. Nobody can give anybody a hard time. So why is that? What does this all come down to? About protesting and objecting to seeing each other in the Chatzer. The Gemara says what this has to do with is something called Lema Behezek Riyakim Apalge. Let's say that Rav Yehuda and Rav Huna argue about is this an issue if the Baal HaChatzer wants to go and use that nail or that beam that's protruding, and they happen to meet each other halfway and see each other, is that considered damaging or not? So Rabbi Yehuda says just seeing each other and damaging each other by looking at each other is not considered a real damage. So therefore, nobody could give each other a hard time, and the Baal HaChatzer cannot protest, okay, and say, hey, Baal HaGag, you got to remove that. But that's according to Rabbi Yehuda. But according to Rav Huna says, yes, absolutely, the Baal HaChatzer could tell the Baal HaGag, hey, I don't like that protrusion coming out because you're going to use it and I'm going to see you. And we're going to be able to see each other, and that's going to be damage to me. Okay, so that's at least the way the Gemara sets up what this machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rav Huna is. The Gemara ends off by saying, well, lo, dekuli al mishmei hezek. Really, we want to establish that everybody holds that this concept of hezek riyah exists. But if that's true, then what about Rav Huna? Remember what Rav Huna said? I'm sorry, what about Rabbi Yehuda? Rabbi Yehuda said that, or at least it sounded like, they can't give each other a hard time in protest. So we say, V'shani hachadamar tashmish lo chazi. L'mai chazi l'mitla b'midei. Mahadran ha'pei. This has nothing to do with hezek riyah. Here, the problem is, this case is a little bit different than hezek riyah, because here the Baal HaGag, meaning the owner of this structure, of this wall, could tell the owner or the part owner of the Chatzer that this usage is not really a efficient use, meaning there's nothing really going on that this protrusion could really do, meaning that I go and I hang something and that's it. I'm not really using it. I'm using it merely as a hook. It's not like I'm using a chatzer, I'm using a machine, I'm using something. This is only a method to hang something. So I go, I put something on the hook, I turn around, and that's it. I'm not working there. I'm not using it in a productive state. So therefore, this has nothing to do with hezek riyah per se. Okay? And like I said, I'll turn my back and I won't, I won't damage you by looking at you. So that's one. Rav Huna would answer and say, no, v'idach amar le zimnin de mivisas. Rav Huna would say, no, I think there is a problem with hezek riyah because sometimes you're going to forget or something is going to happen and you're going to be scared when you're, using the hook, and you're going to turn around and you're going to look at me. So therefore, you can't guarantee that you're never, ever going to look out the window when you're using this hook to hang something. So that's what that machlokas is about. But at least we see from the Gemara that there's this concept of if I have this protrusion coming out and someone wants to use it, how does that affect the person who lives across from him, if they happen to meet each other, if their eyes happen to meet each other? So this concept of hezek riyah, like I said, we had way back in the beginning of the Masechta, because that's really how the Gemara started. If you remember, the very first Mishnah on Daf Beis said, "Hashutafim shiratu lasot mechitza b'chatzer bonon es hakotel be'emtza." Okay, this is good chazara, like I said, from 2 months ago. That if we have two partners who decided, okay, if the wall fell down, if they want to rebuild the wall, so they have to build a wall, and the Gemara on Daf Beis, Amud Beis, actually has two ways of learning the Gemara. Okay, the Gemara says that I could learn the Mishnah literally. When I see the word mechitza, right? When we think of mechitza, we think of a wall, of a barrier, of a barricade, something tangible. The Gemara actually has two ways of looking at it. Are we talking about splitting up a field between two partners, okay, with a physical barrier, or are we splitting it up and just say you take the left side and I take the right side, and the 50-yard line will be our divider, but we don't necessarily need a barrier. Okay, so the Gemara on Daf Beis Amud Beis actually said that the whole reason why you have to build a wall is because one of the parties at least wanted to. But if one of the parties didn't want to, the whole diuk that the Gemara made, if you remember on Daf Beis, was that then one partner doesn't have to force the other partner. Why not? Why doesn't one partner have to force the other partner? Because Gemara says in the third line, Al mehezek lo shmei hezek. Because we're going to learn, at least in one side of the coin, that hezek is not a hezek. And therefore, I can't claim, hey, I have to listen to you and chip in money to build this wall when I'm not interested, right? There's no concept of hezek riyah, of damaging damaging each other just by gazing, right? Invasion of privacy. That's not tangible. That's not a halachic reason or enough of a reason to make me chip in and pay for the wall. However, the Gemara says on the fourth line, Ve'ema mechitza plukta, the Gemara said, well, let's learn the other side of the coin, which is maybe this mechitza is just a mere invisible fence. It's a separation. And therefore, because the kivan deratzu bonan es hakotel bar korcha. And if one of them said, you know what, I want to do it. I don't like this invisible wall. I think we need a real barricade. So the Gemara says, okay, so then when could I force you? I could force you if we think that hezek riyah is a problem. So then we say, Alma hezek riyah shmei hezek. So we already have the source of the difference in opinions about hezek riyah all the way back in the beginning of the Masechta. And as we see, it rears its head again 60 blot later toward the end of the third parak. So let's look at this concept for a second. Meaning, when I say that hezek riyah is considered a hezek or not, is it strong enough that I could say, okay, neighbor, it's time that we take action. Just like I have to protect, or you have to protect your animals from coming in. You have to protect yourself from gazing and looking at my property. And therefore, I could actually force you, just like I could force you to build a fence to keep your animals in, I could force you to build a mechitza between our two sides of the courtyard, our backyard. Okay? So that's the way the Gemara at least sets up how we learn the first Mishnah. Again, is it literally a mechitza, or is it figuratively a mechitza? And the difference is do I have to does this concept of hezek riyah have something tangible about it? Now, in understanding, there's a very interesting chakira that I saw, and Rashi gives us a little bit of a hint. Rashi says, back on Daf Beis, he says, Ein ze yachal lomer lo eini chafetz shetira asaki. Meaning, if you hold that hezek riyah doesn't count, doesn't mean anything, then I can't force you to say, hey, I don't want you to look at my asakim, at my private business. All right, so it sounds from here that there's some kind of tired, there's some kind of damage that the vision, right, of one, or the staring right, of one neighbor toward the other neighbor is doing as opposed to what? So what's the other side of the coin about Hezek Riyah? Okay. The other side of the coin of Hezek Riyah has nothing to do with invasion of privacy per se. It has to do with the fact that I can't work now in my field. I can't work in my chutzner because you are damaging me, not from some evil eye, or there's nothing really tangible here. It's just that I feel so uncomfortable that I have to go now and rent an office down the block, and you're causing me a monetary loss. I would love to work in my yard, okay, in my half of the yard. But because you're watching me, I am now forced to move somewhere else. So, A, I incur an expense of renting an office somewhere else. And B, I'm losing, I'm losing the usage of my yard and I can't get my money's worth from my yard. So this is a real, what we call, this is a real monetary damage. And it's interesting, the nafkamina, what would be the difference? The Rashba explains whether or not I'm allowed to be mocha. Okay, meaning let's say we had this open for a long time. There were years went on, and you were watching me. And one day I decided, hey, I can't work here anymore, right? And or let's say I don't care at all, right? Am I allowed to be mocha, right? Can a person say, you know what? It's not a big deal. So if you say that it has to be damage, that this stems from the damage, like a real monetary damage, then the question is, can you be mochel? Yeah. If you don't mind that, someone's doing damage to you, then okay, then that's your prerogative. Then you could relinquish your claim when someone else damaging you. But if this is more of a special law that there's an ayin hara going on, that cannot be mocha. So there are, aside from that, there's many other nafkaminas, but just to let you, just to understand, there are several interesting, like I said, halachic ramifications about how you view what kind of damage this invasion of privacy actually is or not. The Ramban, okay, in the back of the Gemara, he actually says that he compares that Hezek Riyah is like almost, he calls it Hezek Haguf, okay, and he says that it's so strong that you don't even have a chazak on it. If I, let's say, for 100 years, had this field open, and I went through different partners and generations, and there's never been a problem. Everybody worked together, and no one ever opposed to working in their yard, being stared at, and all of a sudden, one day, a guy wakes up and say, hey, we got to build a wall here. We got to figure this out. The other people can say, hey, we have a chazaka that for 100 years, no one in your family ever had a problem with working out in the open, and now all of a sudden you wake up one day. So that's exactly what the Ramban says. He says, no, this is such a strong nezek that a person can't even say, hey, you have a chazaka of not paying it, chazaka of just letting this lie open. So that's how strong the Ramban puts it. The Rush, he says, it's more of a more of a monetary aspect where, like we discussed, the second side of the coin, where I can't now use my yard, so therefore it's going to cost me to work somewhere else. So he brings various proofs back and forth, but I thought that was a very interesting way of how we view how real this invasion of privacy really is. I was looking, I was thinking about this, and I saw very interesting way that we would look at this, because obviously, legally in today's law, invasion of privacy is illegal, right? There are cases all the time about people suing each other, peeping toms and looking through windows and all kinds of other things. But at least the way the Rishonim, or as I was just explaining in my Hakira, about why would someone be so opposed to being watched that he actually has to go somewhere else and rent space because he can't work in his yard because he's getting stared at all the time. So I saw it in a study actually. This is from a 2016. Okay, it's from a Brighton University in University of Sussex in England. Uh, why performance drops when being watched? Okay, I'm sure we all had this feeling. Now, don't get this confused with what Ben Franklin said, that a watched pot never boils. That has to do with people, you know, um, thinking whatever. That's not for now. That's a different discussion. This is more of it's anxiety. Here, I'm going to read it. The anxiety of being watched can have a disastrous effect on your performance. Neuroscientists at Brighton and Sussex Medical School, blah, blah, blah. Here, Dr. Yoshi and her colleagues, Professor Hugo Critchley, Neil Harrison, okay, were able to pinpoint the brain area that causes the performance mishaps during an experiment using functional neuroimaging. It's called fMRI. In their study published in Scientific Reports, participants' brain activity was monitored while carrying out a task that required them to exert a precise amount of force when gripping an object. Okay, participants reported that they felt more anxious when they believed they were being observed. Under this condition, they gripped the object harder without realizing it. Scan results show that an area of the brain, okay, that helps us control our fine sensory motor functions, the inferior parietal cortex, it's called the IPC, became deactivated when people felt they were being observed. So why am I bringing this up? Obviously, because we're talking about someone having a claim that they can't even work in their own chutzner because, right, they're, again, what is Hezekiah about? They feel that they're being watched, so therefore they can't work efficiently, and they gotta work somewhere else. And here's what they call their their nezek. This is real, right? This is real nezek. So here we go. It's thought this part of the brain works together with another region, the posterior superior temporal sulcus, to form what neuroscientists refer to as the action observation network. The aon is involved in mentalization processes by which we infer what another person is thinking based on their facial expressions and direction of gaze. Okay, so this is something serious. And by the way, it gets better. I saw um, one last article on a related topic where it says this is actually a blog. It's called The Swaddle. Is this normal? I can't do anything right while I'm being observed. So is this person writing an article? He says, left to my devices, I can cook a perfectly decent three-course meal by myself. However, if there's another person present in the kitchen while I cook, I'm bound to burn some dishes, spill oil, water, eggs, and what have you all over myself, my cat, and my kitchen counter, and completely mess up the proportions of spices. This isn't a kitchen problem, though. More often than not, I fail to do things right when I know I'm being observed. It's as though the awareness of having someone's eyes on me prevents me from exercising control over my limbs. Okay? What's assuring, though, is that I'm not the only person to experience this. The last time I took a driving test, I have been driving regularly for years. I failed it twice because the tester was there. Basically, as a Quora user had pointed out, people don't perform worse. Here, this is a very interesting quote, and then I'll go back to Torah. People don't perform worse when someone is watching them. They perform worse when they know that they are being watched. All right, I'll say that one more time. People don't perform worse when someone is watching them. They perform worse when they know that they are being watched. Quite a difference there. So the question is it normal? And then she quotes this article about the study they did with the experiment. But that's a really interesting way of looking at it, meaning that it's knowing or it's thinking that they're being watched. If they're, in a room and they have no idea if they're being watched, it's one thing because they can't tell. But if they know that they're being watched, then, so that goes back to our chakira about what, in a sense, is this invasion of privacy? It, how serious it is it in halacha? Um, you know, so I'll tell you how serious it is. If you look at the Shulchan Aruch and you look in the Rambam says this is pretty serious. You could force someone, like the Mishnah says, if you're intruding on someone. Here, I'm reading from the Rambam in the second parak of Hilchos Shchenim. Chatzer hashutafin sheyesh badin chaluka. Okay, if you have two partners and they own in partnership a courtyard, okay, and it's large enough that you could actually split up. Right? If you remember, Gemara just discussed that it has to be 8 amos because they each need a minimum of 4 amos in depth, right? So if one wakes up and says, I can't look at you anymore, we need to build a wall, because every time, right, you look at me and I can't handle it, then you force you force them to build a wall. Why? Shehezek Ria, Hezeku ve'ein lo chazaka b'chatzer. Hezek Ria is considered real damage. And again, as we said, you can't say, oh, chazaka, we've lived like this in an open state for 25 years. All of a sudden you wake up, like what, you have a midlife crisis, you can't handle this anymore. It doesn't matter. And that's what we said before the Ramban quotes also, that there's no chazaka. You can't claim that you had this way of living forever and one day you just can't handle it anymore. No, there's no chazaka. Ela afal pisha amdu kan kach shanim rabos below mechitza, even though they were partners for 50 years without a mechitza, kofehu lasot mechitza b'chol eis sheyirtze. Okay, one partner could force the other partner to chip in and build a wall and call it quits with this open gazing, and that's really how we paskin the Shulchan Aruch. Choshen Mishpat 157 basically quotes verbatim this Rambam, almost word for word. Be'emtza kedei shelo yireh chaveru b'shash v'mishtamish b'chelko v'afilu amdu kach shanim rabot below mechitza kofelas v'mechitza b'chol es sheyirtze. So he quotes the Rambam. And the Ramah adds in and says something even stronger. V'afilu yesh minhag ba'ir shelo lasoto. What if the minhag, right, somewhere in California, was that we don't care about privacy? You could, right, it's an open society, and that's what the minhag is. Nevertheless, ein holchen achra. We follow the minhag. Here is a rare exception that we completely disregard the minhag to show you how strong the kofel lasoto. Okay, so the question is, why is it so strong? Okay, why is this concept of invasion of privacy such a strong and tangible? Right? Again, when you think of damages, you think about your animal, and you think of shooting an arrow or fire, right? All the arba avos nezikin. Here we have this new concept that just invasion of privacy is this very, very stringent type of damage. And in order to answer that question, we have to look back to our parak of Cheskas Habatim and go back to the last Mishnah of the Perek, because the Gemara actually brings a source. What is the source? Let's look at the Mishnah. Pick it up on Daf Samach. Okay, so now the Mishnah says, so we spoke about physical walls. Now we're going to talk about just looking at each other. Lo yiftach Adam Aman Samach, Aman 60a, the first wide line, Daf Samach Amar Aleph. This was the Daf on Shabbos, Daf Yomi on Shabbos. Lo yiftach Adam l'chatzer hashutfin petach keneged pesach chalon keneged chalon. So here you have, and this is common today when you're building homes, especially in zones or in districts where the homes don't have a lot of setbacks or side yards, and they're built very, very close to each other. And you have a lot of cases where you have two windows that are directly across from each other in different homes. Okay, so if it's there, it's one thing. But if you're building, or if you're building an extension, something new, and you want to open up a window, and you want it exactly where your neighbor's window is, a straight shot across, so the Mishnah says that is a no-no. Or if it's a door, right? If your side door is in the same site as the side door of the neighbor, directly across from each other, that's also not permitted. And the Mishnah goes on to say, not only that, but if it was hayakatan lo yasenu gadol echad lo yasenu shnayim, right? If you had one door and you wanted to add another door, right? You can't move a door. All of these, if it was one, you can't make two, right? You can't enlarge an opening if it's across. All of these privacy issues are noted here in this Mishnah. The Mishnah ends off by saying, but if you're across from a neighbor, but you're across and there's a Reshus Harabim that goes between you two, okay, even though you have a straight shot at his house and you could see exactly what's going on, but because there are so many people that it could also see, right, his problem isn't with you, his problem is with everyone. So everyone's going to see it, so you're just another person. So therefore, you're allowed to build your door, your window directly across. So the Gemara wants to know, what is the source of this? So obviously this has to do with Hezek Riyah, but the Gemara asks, Minahani Mili, how do we know that Hezek Riyah has a biblical source? Okay, Amar Rav Yochanan, Amar Kra, Vayisa Bilam Eseina, Vayaris Yisrael, Shochen Lishvatav. Okay, so here we're going to take a page from Bilam. Okay, Bilam, as we know, was in the midst of cursing the Jewish people, or attempting to curse the Jewish people, and the beginning of Perek Chav Daled in Bamidbar says that he went to a certain area, and he lifted his eyes, and he saw the Jewish people shochen lishvatav. They were all living according to their tribes. We'll see what that means in a second. So the Gemara says, Mara, what exactly did Bilam see? Ra she'ein pischei oholei mechavdin zelazeh. When Bilam lifted his eyes, he noticed that the tents, the doors weren't opposite each other. Amar Ru'uyin halalu shetishra aleihem shchin. He says, how could I curse these people? Right? If anything, they should get a bracha. Because of what I see, the Shechina should dwell amongst them. Okay, so let's look at this. Let's look at this pasuk for a second. Okay, I'm just going to read it because this was actually a few weeks ago. We learned this, not a few weeks ago, about 6 weeks ago. But let's just have a refresh, because this is the pasuk before the famous pasuk of Matovu Ohalecha Yaakov. Okay, that is where this whole concept of privacy comes from. So I'm reading from Balak 24:1. Vayar Bilam kitov b'nei Hashem levarches Yisrael v'lo halach k'pam v'pam likras nachashim vayashes el hamidbar panav. Okay, so Bilam Okay, seeing that it was a good time to bless the Jewish people. Okay, so he went and he faced toward the midbar. Okay, some spirit of God rested on him when he saw the Jews camped lishvatav. Okay, interesting discussion, not for now. What does shesum ha'ayin mean? The whole, okay, Bilam was blind in one eye. Not for now. When we get to Sanhedrin at the end, there's some nice agadata. Well, it's not nice. It's very not nice agadata, but it's interesting agadata about Bilam. So here we go. Pasuk Daled. Neum shomea imar el asher machazeh shadai yechazeh nofel uglu einayim matovu ohalecha Yaakov mishkanatecha Yisrael. So what he's harping on is the ohel, and that's exactly what the Gemara said. What sparked Bilam to all of a sudden give another bracha instead of a klala were the tents that he saw. So if you look in Rashi over here in Balak says, open it, what does he say? He says, Shochen lishvatav. Okay, so again, it says Vayar, right? It says Shochen lishvatav. So Rashi says Ra'a kol shevet v'shevet shochen la'atzmo ve'enan me'uravin. Two things Rashi says. That Bilam saw each tribe, okay, dwelling amongst itself, not mixed up with other tribes. Comma Ra'a she'ein pischein machavin zeh keneged zeh. He saw that the doors don't align of the tents next to each other, so that one could not look into the other's tent. So he quoted that line exactly from our Gemara in Baba Basra. Okay, but if you look at the beginning of the Rashi, you're like, okay, well, what does that mean? He saw each tribe dwelling amongst themselves and not mixed up. So I didn't really understand this. What does the tribes dwelling by themselves have to do with the tents not facing each other, or the openings of the tents not facing each other? So I actually saw a beautiful shot. There's a commentary on Rashi from Rav David Pardo, a 17th century, an 18th century Italian commentator on Rashi. Right, I think I heard the number a few months ago. There are about 770 perushim written on Rashi, right? Commentators just on Rashi. 780, I think. This is one of them. The Maskila David, 17th century from Venice. 18th century from Venice. So he quotes Rashi. He says, it was almost like my question because I didn't understand this. And by luck, I happened to see this. And he says, Vahatam lazeh, the bishlema im hayu hashvatu mu'uravin. So he says, let's focus, forget the tense for a second. Let's focus on this concept of the tribes. So I understand if the shvatim were me'uravin, leika shuma al yusa b'masha hayu pischem shalom echavnim. Right. So this is how he analyzes it. Meaning, I could understand if all the shvatim were all living amongst each other, mixed up, then there'd be no malyusa, there'd be no great blessing that their tents didn't face each other, because why should that be such a great thing? That's a given. After all, kiditnan beperek cheskas abatim, right? That you can't face each other. So big deal. All we were doing was listening to a Mishnah. Why did Bilam get so excited if we were listening to a Mishnah at the end of the day? Right? You did what you're supposed to do. The time the Mishum has agreed, of course you can't face each other. Why did Bilam get so excited? Beautiful. Look at this answer. V'yesh lomar dekol chad mashalo pasach ha-pesach kenegad chavero lagarmi hu diavid kidei shechavra shekenegdo lo yistakel bebeito v'yira lo be'ayin hara. So he says that because each one, right, they didn't face each other, they did it as an advantage so that obviously that they would avoid this concept of ayin hara, which by the way is a completely different aspect of Hezekiah, which I purposely didn't want to talk about because it's way too Kabbalistic. I don't, understand it. I don't like talking about, things I don't understand that much because ayin hara is, like I said, beyond our scope, but that also is a whole, category in it by itself of another sublayer of this Hezekiah. So continues the Maskil David, va'od afilim haya zerotza liftoach hala ma'akev alav al pi hadin lefi shemisyar me'eno ra. Even if you wanted to, you're not allowed to open up across the tent and see someone else. Because why? Because you're going to be scared of the ayin hara. But here's the punchline. But now that all the Shvatim were separated, Yosef, and Yosef was also separated. There's something special about the Shevet of Yosef, which, by the way, who Shevet Yosef? Menashe and Ephraim, right? So Menashe and Ephraim were two more tribes that comprise the 12 Shvatim. And Shevet Yosef, there was no ayin hara. Tolo shalta be ein abisha. V'im ken l'chol ha'pachot shivto shel Yosef hayochol lios hischei mechuvanim. The Hezekiah ain't got. He says because if they were all mixed up, right? I'm sorry, because now that they're separated, you have to take out Yosef. Because when they were mixed up, right, then Yosef was amongst them. And if Yosef was amongst them, then we wouldn't apply ayin hara, because there is no ayin hara when it comes to Yosef. That's why Rashi is forced to say that the tribes were separate in order to take Yosef out of the equation. So then you could ask, well, why did it apply to Yosef if there is no ayin hara? Right? Yosef could look at each other. The tents of Yosef could look at each other. There's no Hezekiah. Forget ayin hara. It's practical because you don't want to look at people, right, getting dressed in the morning, obviously. So therefore, that's why Bilam got all excited, because he says there, it's not just ayin hara, because ayin hara doesn't apply to some of the Jews, but it's the tznius factor. Therefore, by the way, what is this business about Yosef not having any ayin hara? So we've had this Gemara 3 or 4 times already in Shas, but the source comes from a pasuk in Vayechi, right? It's the famous Hamalach HaGoel that we say. At the end of it, so Rashi in Parshas Vayechi on the word Vayigu, he quotes, okay, and this is a Gemara, like I said, the first time it's mentioned is in Brachos Daf Chaf, where it says Kadagim halalu. Yosef is compared to fish. Kadagim halalu sheparim v'ravim, that multiply, ve'ein ayin hara sholetes bahen. And when it comes to fish, there is no ayin hara. Okay, by the way, that's one of the Kabbalistic reasons why fish do not need shchita. It has to do with ayin hara. I'm not going to get into it. You can look up, but that's one halachic aspect of ayin hara and fish, right? The commentators bring down why fish is such an important food that we eat. We eat it on Shabbos. Okay, it's ayin hara related, but the question is, why don't fish get an ayin hara? So for that, the commentator on Rashi, the Bar Nura, says, the ein ayin hara sholetes behen pirish lefi shemuchusin b'mayim. After all, fish are covered in water. We don't see them. Okay, and if we remember from the Gemara in Bava Metzia, we had way back when in the Parak Hamafkid, it said ve'ein habracha mitzuya el bedavar hasamoy min ha'ayin. Right? Remember that Gemara? I think it's on Mem Aleph or so, where it says that if you want a bracha, then you can't know about something, right? Remember, you want to count something, it can't be revealed in front of you. It has to be hidden, right? You have to say the bracha that, right? And then you have to see what your field produces. You can't look at it and say a bracha. So too over here, the bracha is something that's samui min ha'ayin. It's hidden from the eyes. So therefore, what's hidden from the eyes? The fish. They're underwater. We can't see them. So that the fish are full of bracha. That's why there's no ayin hara when it comes to fish. So I thought that was a very interesting halacha. And that's that, at least in terms of Hezekriya. We have a few minutes left. I wanted to just end off the perek, okay, because like I said, it's a we do have a Gadata toward the end, and all the way at the end of the perek, if you remember from Shabbos, the Gemara veers, and I just want to say a couple of words. There's a lot to say on the last few lines, but the Gemara goes into the story of, not the story, but the halachas of Avelus of the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, the Gemara said that it talks about leaving an area in your house unfinished. Okay, this is the source for it, right? The concept of Zecher LeMikdash, of Zecher LeChorban, and it talked about specifically three areas. Okay, the Gemara said, "Am Samach Amud Beis." The first wide line, 60b, Tanaban lo yasud adam is beso besid v'imar b'chul otev mutar, right? You can't make your house extra white, right? When you are stuccoing it, when you're plastering it, you have to have a little off-white in it. Okay, some sand, some teven. So the Gemara goes on to say, Tanu Rabbanan kishachar v'bayis b'shniya. It's a very, very depressing Gemara because it shows how far people went, okay, after the Churban, that the Perushim, right, the zealots of the Jewish people, they said, Shalom lachol basar v'shalom lishta yayin. They said, we can't eat meat anymore, we can't drink wine anymore, we can't have any good memories, because everything, unfortunately, ties back to the Beis Hamikdash. So the Gemara says, Nitba lehen Rabbi Yeshua started talking with them. So he set them up and said, well, explain to me your reason. Amrulo. So they told Rabbi Yeshua, it just reminds us of the karbanos, right? We used to give the karbanos to God for meat. How could we eat meat now? Same thing, right? We would pour wine on the mizbeach. Not a good idea. So he played devil's advocate, did Rabbi Yeshua, and says, okay, bread is also off the table because it was used for menachos, right? So they said, Efshar b'peros, you're right. We'll eat fruit the rest of our life. I mean, it's hard to even take this Gemara literally, like this is what they really wanted to do. How do you eat fruit? Okay, very difficult Gemara to understand. But then Rabbi Yeshua said, okay, well, I got a bigger problem. You can't eat peros because they remind you of the Bikurim, right? And Bikurim don't exist anymore because of the Churban. They say, okay, so we'll eat peros that you didn't have to bring Bikurim on, like, I don't know, watermelon, tangerines, whatever it is, things that weren't Bikurimable. So then he says, well, you can't even drink water because water reminds us of Nisach HaMayim. So Rabbi Yeshua said, listen, I get you guys are upset. But you have to be reasonable. You can't just totally ignore it because we did have a churban. So you have to have some kind of availance. But you can't go overboard, he said. No one's gonna, right? You're like a few percentage of the society. You think you're gonna make these laws and everyone's going to listen. The average person can't handle these kind of rules. So what did they conclude? When you do things, you do it with a little, right? You do it with a little change. Meaning you build a house, you have a little area that you leave unfinished. Gemara says Alma Alama by the door, right? People have that by the door. The little Zecher Migdash. I'm sorry, the Zecher Churban. Some people don't finish any of their house. It's a different story. Then it says also Adam Kol Tzarchei Suda, right? Even when it comes to eating, right? You leave a little bit out, right? You don't have some fish, right? You leave that dish out, Kasa de Harsana, and a woman when she's putting on makeup, right? You leave a little space out, you don't put makeup. Why? Because the Gemara ends off by saying, because of this pasuk of Imesh Gechech Yushalayim Tishkach Yeminit Tibak L'Shoni L'Chiki, right? Because of this pasuk of Imesh Gechech Yushalayim, the Gemara goes on, and it says that you have to do other things. I'm only bringing this because I mentioned this a few years ago, that this concept of mourning the Churban, and I bought this, if you remember, the Gemara in the middle of Tainus spoke about Nachum Ishgamzu. Choni Hamago, and it was discussing that his grandson was once he didn't understand the Shir Hamalos of what we say before benching, as Shiva said, right? He doesn't understand how could a person, right? How could something be like a dream? And then Gemara goes on a very beautiful Agadata that says that he saw someone planting a carob tree, and he says, it's not for me, it's for my grandchildren, and he fell asleep, and 70 years later he woke up. If you remember that, and at that time, this is around 3 years ago, I quoted the Shulchan Aruch, and I'm bringing it only because, first of all, we just had Tisha B'Av, so even though it's a sad topic, but just a little chazara. The beginning of Shulchan Aruch, Orach Chaim, very, very in the beginning, the very first siman, right, says, what do you do when you wake up? You have to, he's gaber ka'ari, you have to wake up like a lion, right? And then the third sif, it says, Ra'ui l'kol yira shamayim sheyehem meitzar v'doeg al churban beis hamikdash. Right? Again, this is talking about what you do in the morning. You wake up like a lion and you get ready to daven, and right away the Shulchan Aruch says, you know what you got to do? You have to be doeg on the churban beis hamikdash. Okay? And what does the Mishnah Brura say on that? I'm reading from the Mishnah Brura. Kasav shla shebachol seuda yomer al naharos bavel. You ever wonder why we say al naharos bavel? Well, we don't say it, unfortunately, but there are those who say it on a weekday, just like we say Shir Malos on Shabbos. So the al naharos bavel we do say on weekdays is because we want to remember the Beis Hamikdash, exactly what the Shulchan Aruch says. Not only in Av, not only in the bad times, during the whole year. And that's why he sticks it all the way in the beginning. The very, very first siman in Shulchan Aruch says you have to remember the Churban Yerushalayim. And he says that's why, and then the Chafetz Chaim, the Mishnah Brura, says Kasav Ashla, we say Al Noras Bavel, B'Shabbos, B'chem Yom She'en Umrim Tachnon, Yom Ashir Amalos, V'ha'ikar Sheyeda Makama. Right? Hear what he says. The main thing is to know what you're saying. Right? You don't just sing it, you have to know what the words are. Why do you have to know what the words of Al Noras Bavel are? Right? When it says Imesh Gachech, it's not just a beautiful song, you have to understand it because that brings our emotion. To hearken back to what the Shulchan Aruch said is you have to remember, just like you wake up and you thank God that you have your soul back and you're ready to daven and start your day and do whatever you do, it's important to remember the Churban Habayis. All right. And that's the end of the parak. There's a lot more stuff I didn't get to, but We'll call it a night.